Hey everyone, today I'm going to take a quick look at Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. So the main idea of Nancy Pearcey's book here is she's basically contending against dualism, to use the philosophical term. So she's contending against this idea that the mind and the body, or the person, the idea of a person can be split from their body, hence the title Love Thy Body. She's contending for basically reclaiming this notion of embodiment, or what philosophers call physicalism. So a physicalist will say that the mind and the body can't be split. A dualist will say they can be split into two different ideas. So this is her taking on this idea of dualism, and more than just kind of taking it on, she's arguing that dualism is what's underneath a lot of what's happening culturally. So then she goes into chapters on things like abortion, assisted suicide, sexual ethics, and the transgender conversation. So she kind of goes into all of those ideas with this idea of exploring how is this metaphysical dualism kind of informing or setting the parameters for our conversations in culture today. So that's what Love Thy Body is about. The research behind what she's doing is it's a lot of, she's pulling on some philosophers, people like Nietzsche will show up, people like Kant and Hegel and stuff. And I have to say I personally found her research a little bit mixed. She does cite primary sources of some of those philosophers. She does rely on secondary sources as well, which is just, that is what it is. That may or may not frustrate you. And I did occasionally, not all the time, I don't want to overstate this, but I did have a few moments when I was reading this book and I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea. I wonder where she got that. And I flipped to the end notes and then saw that she was saying, and then she would say, look at one of my other books for this. That grated on me it just happened a few times where I was excited to see kind of where she was getting this idea, and then she just pointed to one of her other books. Now, I don't want to judge too harshly on that, because maybe in that other book, maybe she provides more of the original sources of it. I don't know. But I think if you read nonfiction like me, and you read with an eye on where ideas come from, which again, that's why I'm kind of I prefer footnotes over endnotes, just as an aside, for that reason, because I like to kind of read along with, while I'm reading the book, I like to see where these things are kind of coming, what threads are being pulled on. I found that a little frustrating as a reading experience. But she does go to primary sources as well. I don't want to make it sound like she's not referring to anything out of her own work. She does pull on some original philosophers' work, and especially when she talks about Supreme Court cases, she quotes directly from the opinions that were written and those kinds of things. So the research is a little bit of a mixed bag, but overall it's fairly solid. And the readability is very high. I would argue it's a super readable book. I mean, it's long-ish, but I ripped through it pretty quickly because it's just very conversational. It's written in a very kind of compelling way. Like you want to keep seeing how is she going to keep exploring these ideas. And so it's very, very compulsively readable, I would say. I went through it pretty quickly. I actually found it, generally speaking, with a few wrinkles I'll mention here in my final thoughts in a second, but generally speaking, I found it a super enjoyable read. So a couple final thoughts on Love Thy Body. I'm going to start with some of my critiques on my final thoughts because I want to end on a positive note, because I did overall like this book, but I didn't like everything about it. So first, I don't know if this is a critique or not. This is a question I have. She explicitly is trying to talk about sexuality, especially in the kind of the cultural conversation we're having. I kept thinking, man, I wish she talked about the subject of race and racial identity and ethnicity, but specifically race, because I think there's a wide open conversation here about the importance of embodiment and reclaiming our bodies, loving our bodies, as she would say, and what implications does that have on the race and justice conversation we're experiencing in our culture. So not necessarily a critique, because you have to contain your book, you have to contain your argument somewhere, you have to have boundaries around it, I get that. I just kept thinking, man, I wish that she engaged with race in this book instead of just issues of sexuality and gender. So that's one thought. A couple more shorter, I guess, critiques. Her exegesis of culture is good, which I'll say more about at the end. great, actually, the way that she pays attention to cultural trends and diagnoses them. Her philosophical history, her way she traces the history of ideas, is less great. Gets a little simplistic. She throws around names like Hegel, like Darwin. She uses very kind of simplistic diagnoses of what is Darwin's evolutionary thought. What are the implications of that? I mean, she'll cover it in a couple sentences and then move on and basically say this problem comes from this thinker, and then move on from it. And it's like a gloss. It goes over so quickly. And every time I read one of those sections where specifically she was talking about the history of the idea, like where does it come from in philosophical currents, I kept thinking, I don't think it's that simple. There's more nuance here. I don't think she talks about Descartes. I'd read a section on Descartes and I think, I don't know if Descartes would actually say that this is what he is saying. So I found her philosophical historical work a little frustrating in that sense. A little simplistic is probably the best word for it. Also, she relied a little bit too heavily on anecdotal evidence, in my view. She talked a lot about anecdotes of people in the transgender chapter or in the sexual ethics chapter. I would have liked a little more data, a little more in the statistical data as opposed to qualitative. And related to that, the last chapter I found frustrating. She veers a little bit. She's clearly coming from a conservative position, and she veers a little bit into almost scaremongering. I don't think that that's what she was trying to do, but her language around the state taking control of the family and the state taking control of your children, and if some of these norms get eroded, according to kind of her diagnosis, the state is just going to take on more and more of these things. And it started to get a little it felt a little scaremongering to me, honestly, and that a little bit of that slippery slope argument that a lot of people can fall into when they critique culture. I found that felt frustrating to me. So those are some of my critiques. Those are some of my flaws. That being said, I really did like this book. I kept thinking the analogy of, as I was like, it's like I was eating a really good meal, and then every once in a while I'd be like, ugh, what was that? And there would be like a hair in my mouth. But overall, I liked the meal. I liked the meal she was preparing. And I think her central premise is great. I think that the idea of metaphysical dualism is totally rampant in our culture and is totally behind a lot of the issues, the debates that we're having, that the Christian church really needs to have a more thoughtful engagement on. And her cultural exegesis, like I said a minute ago, is really good. When she's pointing out cultural trends, things that are showing up in the Supreme Court, or just court cases in general, or the media, or the way the narrative is kind of told. Her chapter on abortion I thought was really good in pointing out some of the kind of the ways the debate is framed by culture that we need to be really cognizant of if we're going to engage well. So when she's diagnosing what's happening around us and in our kind of cultural discourse, that's where the book is the strongest. I think that's where she does her best work. It's just that when it veers into some of those other territories I mentioned, it starts to get a little weaker or a little more of a frustrating experience. But overall, it's good. And I would, with everything I just said, I think that she is a really valuable voice in this conversation, and I think she's talking about really important stuff. So I hope that you found this helpful. If what I've just said interests you, then maybe check out the book Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you for my next review.